In 1942, in the middle of the Second World War, Rolex produced 12 watches. Not 12,000, 12. They were oversized stainless steel chronographs 44 millimeters across, powered by a split-seconds movement of a complexity Rolex has never attempted before or since. They were never offered for sale. They never appeared in a Rolex catalog. They were given, as gifts, to members of a select group of motor racing teams competing in events across Italy. The drivers wore them over their race suits or handed them to pit crew members to time-lapse. When those drivers died, their families kept the watches in drawers for decades, unaware of what they held. The first one surfaced at auction in 1991, consigned by the widow of a racing team member. It sold for 82,000 Swiss francs. The same watch, the same object, sold again in 2013 for over 1 million. A different example from the same 12-watch production run sold in 2016 for 2,405,000 Swiss francs. In 2024, another came up in Monaco and hammered down at $3,500,000. 3 examples of the 12 have never been found. They exist somewhere in the world in the possession of people who do not know what they are sitting on. We are going to go through the Rolex watches so rare that no amount of money, no relationship with a dealer, no waiting list, no private contact can get you one, and explain exactly why each of them exists and what made it impossible. If you have walked into a Rolex authorized dealer recently, you might believe you encountered scarcity. Display cases marked exhibition only, polite explanations about registration of interest, salespersons who will not confirm whether there is a list or how long it is. You assume that with enough patience, enough money, enough purchases of things you did not particularly want from the same dealer, you will eventually receive the call. For common sports models like the Submariner or GMT Master, that assumption is now closer to accurate than it was 3 years ago, when the frenzy was at its peak. But there is another category entirely, a category that operates by completely different rules, where the waiting list is not 2 years or 5 years, but infinity, because the watches do not exist in sufficient quantities for money to solve the problem. 3 examples have never been found. No vault, no private sale, no auction will surface them until the person holding them decides to look at what they have. They are not unavailable. They are invisible. The industry has no mechanism to reach them, and they are only one chapter of the story we are going to tell you today. The problem with understanding Rolex rarity starts with a gap buried inside how the brand communicates about itself. Rolex produces approximately 1 million watches per year. That figure is publicly cited, broadly confirmed, and functions as a kind of ceiling on the imagination of people thinking about scarcity. 1 million is a large number. 1 million watches distributed across dozens of references and configurations allocated to authorized dealers in every country on Earth is a number that suggests abundance. And for most of the catalog, it represents exactly that. But the number does nothing to prepare you for what happens at the extreme edge of the brand's history, where production runs were not 1 million, not 1,000, not 100, where 12 watches were made for a racing team in wartime Italy, and 3 of them have not been seen in 80 years. Here is exactly how Rolex rarity actually works. The brand's scarcity operates on at least 4 completely distinct levels, each one more extreme than the last, and most people who follow the watch industry have only ever encountered the first. The first level is deliberate supply restriction on current production. Rolex produces the Cosmograph Daytona in steel, reference 126500LN in very limited quantities relative to demand. A dealer in a major market might receive 1 or 2 examples of a specific dial configuration per year. An authorized dealer with 40 annual allocations of the standard black Submariner might receive a single steel Daytona. For a customer without an established relationship and spending history, the wait to purchase a steel Daytona at retail is measured not in months but in years, if it comes at all. The model trades on the secondary market at prices between $28,000 and $35,000 against a retail of approximately $14,800. That premium exists entirely because supply is structured to ensure that demand perpetually exceeds it. Rolex has denied deliberately restricting production. The mathematics of the allocation system suggest otherwise. But this is the ordinary rarity of a brand that has built its commercial infrastructure around the idea of waiting. It is the beginning of the conversation, not the end. The second level is off-catalog and limited special orders. In the early 1980s, Sultan Qaboos bin Said Al Said, the ruler of Oman, commissioned a small number of jewel-set Rolex Daytona chronographs through Asprey of London. The reference was 6270. The watches featured the Kunjar crest of Oman engraved on the caseback. They were set with diamonds and precious stones in a configuration that Rolex has never produced before or since in standard production. They were made to be given as diplomatic gifts, not sold at retail. Only 8 examples are known to exist. In October 2025, one of them sold at Sotheby's for $5,230,000. That price reflects not the complication of the movement or the quality of the materials alone. It reflects the fact that 8 examples exist in the entire world, that one of them carries the direct commission of a head of state, and that when one surfaces, the collector community treats it as a singular event rather than a market transaction. You cannot buy one from a dealer, you cannot register interest, you cannot spend your way to the front of any queue. You can only wait for an estate sale or an auction, and hope that the other 7 owners of the remaining 8 never have reason to part with theirs. The third level is watches that were never produced for sale at all. Here is a story that explains exactly why some of the most valuable Rolexes in the world came from a drawer rather than a boutique. In the early 1940s, Rolex was involved in sponsoring motor racing across Europe. The company had a relationship with several Italian racing teams competing in events, including the Giro di Sicilia, the Tour of Sicily, a grueling race across the island's roads. For reasons that have never been fully documented, Rolex commissioned a small production run of an extraordinarily complex chronograph. The reference 4113 was the only split-seconds, or rattrapante, chronograph the brand ever produced. A split-seconds complication allows a driver or a pit crew member to measure 2 events simultaneously with a single instrument, one hand running continuously, while a second hand can be stopped independently to record an interval before catching up. For 1942, in a 44mm steel case, this was engineering of a complexity rarely attempted by any manufacturer, let alone Rolex, whose history has always favored robust and reliable over technically extravagant. The watches were given to racing team members. They never appeared in any catalog. They were numbered sequentially from 051313 to 051324, 12 watches in total. When the first one surfaced at auction in 1991, scholars did not even know how many had been made. It took years of research across multiple auction houses, private collections, and family estates to establish that 12 existed. 3 remain unaccounted for today. The fourth level is a category that barely has a name in the mainstream watch world. It is the watches that were made in normal production, in configurations nobody valued at the time, that survived in such small numbers because the world simply discarded them. In the early 1970s, Rolex produced a version of the Daytona in 18-karat white gold. This was unusual. Most Daytonas of the era were stainless steel or yellow gold. White gold was an expensive and relatively impractical choice for a tool watch designed to time racing. The watch sold poorly. It was not a success. Dealers moved it at discount. Buyers who wanted a Daytona wanted steel or yellow gold, not an expensive metal that looked like silver. Over the following decades, the white gold Daytonas disappeared. Some were melted down, some were lost, some were given away and forgotten. When a single example surfaced at auction in 2018, scholars realized that as far as the collector community could determine, only one white gold Daytona reference, 6265, was known to exist in the entire world. The auction house Phillips called it the unicorn. It sold for $5.9 million. The most expensive object in the room was a watch that had sold poorly when it was new. Then there is what happens when celebrity provenance meets production scarcity. The two variables compound each other in ways that produce auction results that look like errors until you understand the arithmetic. In November 2023, a Rolex GMT Master Reference 1675 sold at Christie's Geneva for $5.12 million. That result was nearly triple the price it had achieved when it first sold in 2019 for $1,950,000. The same watch, 4 years, the same object. What happened in those 4 years was not a change in the movement or the material or the dial. What happened was that the collecting community spent 4 more years studying the watch and understanding what it was. The watch had belonged to Marlon Brando. He wore it during the filming of Apocalypse Now in 1979, and because he found the bezel distracting on camera, he removed it himself, leaving the watch with a bare case middle and no bezel insert. The mark of his modification remained on the physical object. That modification is, in the language of the collector market, a deduction from technical condition and an enormous addition to historical significance. The watch Brando wore on the set of one of the defining films of American cinema, modified by his own hand, is worth more than the technically perfect version of the same reference precisely because his hand touched it. No amount of money can create another. He is dead. The film is finished. The watch exists once. The craft watch boom made everything in this category more expensive, and it did so for a reason the industry will not explain. After 2017, when Paul Newman's personal Daytona sold for $17,752,000, and the auction world recognized that vintage Rolex was a legitimate asset class, money, that had previously ignored watches began paying attention. Wealth managers started advising on timepieces as portfolio diversifiers. Family offices began acquiring rare references. The category of people capable of writing a $10 million check for a watch expanded significantly. Here is the problem nobody explained. Money can compete for things that exist. It cannot compete for things in unknown possession. The 3 reference 411 3/split-seconds chronographs that have not been found are not in a vault somewhere waiting for the right offer. They are almost certainly in estate situations where the owner does not know the watch's significance. When they will emerge from a drawer or an inheritance or an attic. Until that moment, no amount of capital, no dealer relationship, no collector network can accelerate their appearance by a single day. That is a different kind of rarity from anything the primary market produces, because the primary market, however carefully managed, ultimately resolves with the transaction. The missing 3 do not resolve until they are found. Walk a major auction calendar right now. Count the Rolex lots that carry auction estimates above $1 million. You will count them before you reach the end of the catalog. Here is a number that explains exactly why the rarest examples keep setting records regardless of the broader market. Swiss watch exports fell nearly 10% in volume in 2024. Swatch Group's operating profit collapsed 75%. Richemont's specialist watchmakers division declined across multiple consecutive quarters. The industry was in a documented slump driven by cooling demand in China, macroeconomic pressure on discretionary spending, and the withdrawal of pandemic-era speculation that had inflated prices across the market. In that same period, the reference 4113 sold for $3.5 million. The Rolex King Daytona reference 6270 sold for $5 million. The reference 6062 Dragon sold for $1,758,000. The ultra-rare watches appreciated against the trend of the broader market because their supply is not controlled by production decisions. It is controlled by the number of examples that exist and the willingness of current owners to sell. When those owners do sell, they sell into a buyer pool that includes the wealthiest collectors in the world. The price clears at wherever the second most motivated buyer runs out of appetite. And when the object is one of 12, or one of 8, or one of 1, the second most motivated buyer is paying a great deal of attention. Then there is what happens to the watches that fall between the categories. Not so rare that they appear at auction once per decade, but rare enough that finding the right example requires years of patience and a very specific kind of knowledge. It is called the dial variation. Rolex produced the Daytona across decades in configurations where the only material difference between references is the dial. The same case, the same movement, the same bracelet, a different dial, in some cases a different color applied to a sub-register, in some cases a different font on the text, in some cases a different material used to print the indices. Those dial variations are the difference between a watch that trades for $60,000 and a watch that trades for $600,000. The Paul Newman dial is the most famous example, but the logic applies across dozens of references. The so-called tropical dials, where the original lacquer or bakelite material has aged to a warm brown or caramel tone over decades, carry premiums of hundreds of % over the standard version of the same reference. The aging is random. It cannot be predicted at manufacture, replicated in a laboratory, or faked without detection by serious collectors. The dial you are looking at on a watch produced in 1967 either tropicalized or it did not. The ones that did are now in a separate market from the ones that did not. And that market is accessible only to the buyer who understood what they were looking at long before it became obvious. So if the category of extraordinary Rolex rarity is entirely removed from the world of authorized dealers and wait lists and spending history, does that mean the collector with patience and knowledge has no way in? No, it means you stop thinking like a retail customer and start thinking like a scholar. Every serious rare Rolex has a reference number, a production window, a set of known case numbers, and a documented auction history. That history is public. Phillips, Christie's, Sotheby's, and Antiquorum maintain searchable archives of every significant Rolex lot they have offered. The reference 4113 has appeared at major auction houses 6 times in the past 30 years. Each appearance is documented with condition reports, provenance notes, and realized prices. The collector who studies those 6 sales understands more about the 12 watches than the person who simply knows they are expensive. Understanding the specific case numbers that have surfaced, the provenance chains connecting them to their original recipients, the condition variations between examples, is the kind of knowledge that positions a buyer correctly when the 7th or 8th example appears. That preparation cannot be purchased. It has to be accumulated, but it is the only thing that separates the buyer who is ready from the buyer who is simply wealthy. But there is a second option that almost nobody outside serious collector circles knows about, and it is the most important thing to understand if this category interests you. It is called provenance research. Before any major auction of a significant Rolex, the auction house publishes condition and provenance research that frequently includes documentation not previously public. Family letters, racing team records, estate inventories, import documents. That research is freely available in the printed catalog and increasingly online. The collector who reads it before the sale understands not just what the watch is, but why it exists, where it has been, and what makes this specific example different from others of the same reference. That understanding is what a bidder needs in the room. Most people looking at a $5 million Rolex see the price and assume the auction house has done the thinking for them. The serious collector has already done the thinking and arrives knowing exactly what they are prepared to pay and why. Most people walk right past that research entirely. And then there are the references that sit just outside the headlines, known to specialists but not yet discovered by the broader market that has driven the most famous examples to stratospheric prices. The Rolex reference 6062 Baudai became globally famous when it sold at Phillips in 2017. The last emperor of Vietnam had purchased it in Geneva in 1954, walked across the street from his hotel to a dealer, and selected the rarest and most precious piece in the shop, a yellow gold oyster perpetual with a black dial, diamond hour markers, and a triple calendar with moon phase, one of 3 known black dial variants. It sold in 2017 for $5.1 million. In 2025, a different reference 6062 in the same configuration, one of only 3 known examples in that specific setup, sold for $6.21 million. That watch had been held in private hands for decades, undisturbed, near mint, unseen by the market. When it appeared, the collector world treated its emergence as an event. The watches sitting in private collections right now, unknown, unstudied, belonging to people who received them as gifts or inherited them from relatives who worked in industries connected to Rolex's mid-century sponsorships, are the next version of that story. They will emerge. They cannot be scheduled. But there is a third thing worth understanding about this category, and it is the most important. It is called the production anomaly. Rolex manufactured watches in a period where quality control, while high, did not prevent every unit from being slightly different from every other. Materials sourced from different suppliers, dials printed in slightly different color batches, cases finished to the same standard, but in a period where subtle tooling variations existed run to run. Those anomalies, invisible to the original owner, invisible to the watchmaker who serviced the watch, invisible to every subsequent owner who did not know what they were looking for, are now the subject of detailed horological scholarship. A Daytona with a specific sub-register color variation, produced during a narrow window in the early 1970s, can be identified only by a collector who has spent years studying the reference. That collector, buying from an estate sale or a private seller who does not recognize the variation, is buying something worth 10 times the price they paid from a person who did not know what they had. That gap between knowledge and price is the oldest opportunity in collecting. It exists in watches as clearly as it exists in art, in books, in anything made by human hands, in quantities too large to track and too old to remember. The industry is counting on your assumption that Rolex rarity is a function of wait lists and spending history and authorized dealer relationships. It is counting on you to believe that the most desirable Rolexes are the ones you see on social media and in auction headlines, the ones already known, already priced, already competed for by every collector with the capital to participate. It is counting on you never to look at what was made in 1942 for a racing team in Sicily, gifted and forgotten, surfacing 80 years later from a drawer. Never to read the provenance research in a sale catalog before the hammer falls. never to learn enough about dial variations to recognize one in an estate that does not know what it holds. The rarest watches are not in authorized dealer cases waiting for the right spending history. 3 of them have not been found at all. The knowledge to identify the others when they surface is available to anyone willing to do the work. Stop waiting for an allocation, start reading the scholarship.